Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm going to talk tonight a bit about Eisenhower's domestic record, and we're moving away from McCarthyism now. I've said more than enough about that, and if you want to look back over the last few months, there's plenty to be to listen to on that subject. The problem sometimes when you look at a key issue like McCarthyism and the Red Scare is it obscures other really revealing things, and it obscures particular currents in political thinking and in policy that are, if you can examine them, really tell you an interesting story. So a popular view of the Eisenhower years is that this was a kind of a post-war return to the dominance of the nuclear family, the joys of suburbia, the kind of hill valley in Back to the Future vision of America. That period of kind of patriarchal consolidation for sure, and the marginalisation of those considered to be socially or in other ways deviant. But for the white American nuclear family of Middle America, a kind of a golden age, and to some extent that's true. But that obscures actually how Eisenhower viewed the world and viewed his position as president. Eisenhower is far more right wing than is given credence for. The fact that the subsequent Republican presidents are Nixon with Ford in the middle, and then Reagan, who certainly are move the kind of the Overton window of discourse far to the economic and social right, rather kind of ignores, takes the spotlight off Eisenhower. And one thing that kind of obscures Eisenhower as well is one of the constraints that Eisenhower was under. Eisenhower was the first Republican president since Hoover, and in between there had been Roosevelt and to a lesser extent Truman, both of whom, Roosevelt having been elected 4 times, having passed not only the New Deal but having spent infinitely greater sums during the Second World War mobilising the entire nation to defeat Nazism. Unpicking the New Deal so soon after, really a decade after its architect had died, is politically unfeasible, and as a result, the New Deal shaped American politics and discourse really all the way up to Reagan, and Reagan is the president who makes has the biggest contribution to undoing it, though one of Nixon's first kind of acts was swinging budget cuts, and the kind of the introduction of kind of a deliberate manufactured government austerity. And the reason for this, because the New Deal was considered an anathema to the Republicans, who never embraced it, who always opposed it, and who always swore to undo it. They viewed it as the growth, the unacceptable growth of the state, and it's finally Reagan that kills it off in his in the early 1980s, the last vestiges of it, and we see a similar ideological offensive on this side of the Atlantic with the Conservative Party and its relentless destruction of all aspects of the 1945 post-war settlement, the last one being the NHS, which is being dismantled bit by bit. Okay, So tonight we're reading from Grand Expectations again by James Patterson, and Patterson writes, although McCarthy and Red Scare issues threatened to obscure other political matters in the early 1950s, they were by no means the only concern of the era. Other domestic controversies, mostly fomenting political deadlock, illuminated Eisenhower's strengths and weaknesses in these years. Liberals who explored Eisenhower's philosophy concerning these domestic issues were sure that he was ill-informed and near-reactionary. Concerning social welfare, he had snapped in 1949, if all Americans want is security, they can go to prison. He said of the Tennessee Valley Authority, by God, I'd like to sell the whole thing, but I suppose we can't go that far. Like most politicians at the time, he paid little attention to widespread rural poverty or to urban decay. Eisenhower himself conceded that he was a conservative on domestic issues, admitting that Taft, who had come to favour federal aid to education and public housing, was by far more liberal and radical than anything to which I could ever agree. And I think there are two standout interesting things there. Firstly, when he talks about the Tennessee Valley Authority, this massive provision of hydroelectric dams and electrification for 14 states in the centre, south and west of America. He says, I'd like to sell the whole thing, but I suppose we can't go that far. There's the recognition that the dismantling of the New Deal in its entirety would be political suicide. And this is the only reason why the Republicans were measured and gradual in their approach. They knew that there's only so much you can do. There's only so much you can do to tear up social safety nets and to kind of expose the public to the vagaries of market forces. The second that Patterson points out is that his disinterest in rural poverty or urban decay was not unique. It was shared by most politicians at the time, because most politicians at the time in both Republican and Democrat parties are elected in order to service one or other aspect of the business elites. The New Deal was not about socialism, it was about creating the economic framework to stabilise capitalism, to stop it, as it periodically does, from devouring itself. And the opponents of the New Deal are opposed principally because the wealthy moneyed interests of America view it as inconvenient or as a threat to their personal wealth or share values. Eisenhower seemed so vulnerable on domestic matters that liberals had a field day making fun of him. Some dubbed him Eisenhower. When he tried to summarise his domestic philosophy by saying that he was conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings, Adlai Stevenson, ever quick with a quip, retorted, I assume what it means is that you will strongly recommend that the building of a great many schools to accommodate the needs of our children, but not provide the money. So, Patterson writes, like most wisecracks in politics, this one was a little unfair. Eisenhower was indeed uninformed on domestic matters when he became president, but he did have a fairly coherent philosophy of government. It was well described in a statement of Abraham Lincoln's that he liked to repeat. The legitimate aim of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In all that the people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. So it was a view of social conservatism, that there can be and should be some sort of safety net there, but it should be at the bare minimum. It should be the minimum amount, and because of this conservative idea about the individual, about how the state will inevitably sap the enterprise and initiative of the individual if the state does too much, and the vitality of America was at stake, and the ingenuity that had powered America would be kind of robbed by the excessive functioning of the state. This is a very obviously kind of ahistorical view of things, and the kind of wealth of America that was generated in the 19th century was, there were pioneering people, but there was also the mass evictions of Native Americans from their lands, the buildings of railroads with cheap Chinese labor, and all these kind of exploitative things. It's rugged individualism kind of has to exist within a context of colonialism in order for it to make any sort of sense. So that this sort of individualist, frontiery sort of attitude and ideology has a kind of rather unpleasant hidden aspects to it. People reaching out to grab things that originally belonged to other people. What is meant in practice? What is meant in practice was what his most enthusiastic supporters called modern republicanism, writes Patterson. This was a little right of centre in emphasis. Believing in limited government, Eisenhower passionately endorsed conservative fiscal policies, balancing the budget and cutting government spending. Even on defence were his highest goals. Eisenhower spoke at the end of his presidency famously about the military-industrial complex and how bad that would be. This kind of toxic mix of government spending and arms-producing oligarchs and oligarchies. Curbing spending, in turn, helped bolster his philosophical opposition to federal aid to education, a major cause of liberals in the 1950s, and to socialised medicine. He sought to cut costly federal price support to agriculture. He approved legislation returning Tideland's oil, which liberals argued belonged to the national government, to private interests in the states. He wanted above all to decrease the role of government because he believed that large-scale federal intervention threatened individual freedom, the ultimate good in life. To be conservative did not mean to be reactionary. Eisenhower was emphatic about the distinction between the two. Although he sought to reduce spending, he was not a mindless slasher. The Republican right complained that he did not cut federal expenditures enough when he took over. A young conservative senator, Barry Goldwater of Arizona, later said that Ike ran a dime-store New Deal. Now, obviously, we've talked about Goldwater an awful lot in the past, however many years. Goldwater is this pivotal figure from about 1964 onwards, who has actually before 64, up to his fatal attempt to unseat unseat Johnson, and he gifts Johnson with the biggest landslide victory in 64 in American history to that point. Goldwater's ideas, which were hugely, which were embraced and kind of brought to bear later by Reagan, were perhaps a little bit before their time. The ideological framework existed, but the kind of the correct economic and social conditions, the correct crises, didn't exist at that point in order for them to really resonate with people. The idea of dramatic cuts to state spending, dramatic cuts to taxation, the idea that that an individual's money belongs to them, and that taxation is some form of theft, and the state is fundamentally illegitimate. All this kind of really crazy stuff. To people like Goldwater, Eisenhower was really just a phony, somebody who spoke in the language of conservatism but didn't really mean it. Like most public figures at the time, the presidents accepted the need for a little compensatory fiscal policy when times demanded it. And keeping a close eye on spending was not an abstract end in itself, but a means of warding off inflation, which seemed to him and to many contemporary economists to be the most worrisome problem during and immediately after the economically stimulating Korean War. if you have a country like America that's going through an economic boom after the Second World War, that is reaching full capacity economically in terms of its annual levels of growth, and then you pump into it a massive conflict like the Korean War, where state spending has to shoot up on everything from electronics through to rubber tires through to textiles and fabrics and dyes for uniforms, the whole lot, then you get a problem with inflation, because there's no productive spare, unused productive capacity in the economy for this additional liquidity to go to. So you wind up with a bidding war for commodity prices. This administration did help to control, and the next few years were remarkably prosperous and stable. Even Galbraith, J.K. Galbraith, this is the Democrat supporting economist, no friend of the GOP economic policy, conceded that in January 1955, the administration as a whole had shown remarkable flexibility in the speed with which it had moved away from these slogans of balanced budgets. So that's the sort of thing that Galbraith would inevitably think was a good thing. So Eisenhower, in these difficult moments, was able to be flexible and non-dogmatic. The president was also proved ready to accept a few moderately liberal ventures in the realm of social policy. Should any political party attempt to abolish social security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labour laws and farm programmes, he warned his conservative brother Edgar, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. He thereupon signed in 1954 a broadening of social security. He also sought to extend the minimum wage, which covered fewer than half the wage workers in the United States. Both programs, of course, were financed primarily by employers and workers, not by federal funds that might increase federal deficits. But Eisenhower in no way threatened the welfare state begun in the New Deal years. Social welfare expenditures during his presidency rose slowly but steadily as a percentage of GNP, from 7.6% in 1952 to 11.5% in 1961, especially after 1958, as a percentage of federal spending. So that's the kind of the core of this, and I suppose the core of this particular episode is how significant the New Deal was in constraining the budget slashing instincts of presidents after Roosevelt, and how the nascent kind of new Republican right that was emerging in figures like Goldwater, and of course Nixon is Eisenhower's vice president, and Reagan during these years is developing really from the kind of the absolute fringes of the Republican movement, and had been a kind of had been a speaker on behalf of American capital to disgruntled American workers for many years. It was where actually he first started to see his first real money, extolling these ideas that in the 1970s and 80s really capture the mainstream. They really capture centre stage, and they are still enormously powerful even now through the kind of the use of right-wing think tanks and dark money and the Koch brothers and all that sort of thing. They kind of have now mutated into different kinds of different sorts of arenas. Things to do with climate change and denying the basic reality of climate science and that sort of thing, or at least sort of slowing it down and preventing the interests of oil companies and investment funds that do very well after that sort of thing from being affected. So the New Deal was this kind of historic barrier to the Republican right, and they persistently chipped away at it until we have an America once again that is riven by enormous economic disparities and insecurities. But that's a conversation for another time. Beyond these moves lay a larger vision of what the United States should be, a cooperative society in which major groups such as corporations, labour unions and farmers would set aside their special interests to promote domestic harmony and economic stability. See, politicians love that. They love the idea that competing groups, some of whom will win, some of whom will have to lose, should voluntarily lay down their cudgels and say, well, we're all Americans, aren't we? Or we're all British, aren't we? Or we're all Germans, or what have you, and simply function in some greater sense of the national interest. But of course, that's to completely misunderstand the functioning of society. You know, a high school sociology textbook will tell you that. The state, Eisenhower believed, could serve as an arbiter of this cooperative commonwealth, acting to bring excessive special interests together and restraining their demands. As in his dealings with McCarthy, however, Ike shrank from involving the presidency in controversial questions. Better, he thought, to stand above the battle and in doing so preserve his political standing. Partisanship, moreover, was to Ike a word every bit as dirty as special interest. He complained that Truman had used ward boss strong-arm tactics that had not worked and had diminished the prestige of the presidency. He added, "I'm not one of those desk-panning types that likes to stick out his jaw and look as if he is bossing the show. I don't think it's the function of the President of the US to punish anybody for voting as he likes." In holding this Whiggish view of the presidential role, Eisenhower indeed conserved his personal prestige and popularity. If he had tried to push through major domestic legislation, he would surely have provoked determined opposition. Contemporary measures of public opinion indicated the majority of middle-class and politically influential Americans in the 1950s, especially after the aftermath of the Korean War, did not look to government for great changes. So I suppose there is an element to say that the presidents may influence the times, but it's the people that make the presidents or vote for particular presidents, and perhaps Eisenhower had astutely read the mood of Middle America and presented them with the figure that they actually wanted. This figure who had this brand of modern republicanism and a kind of fairly limited government that would give a social safety net which created a sense that America was at least some kind of a harmonious society, but not one which threatened some of the cherished nostrums that American the American sense of America's sense of itself was built on, such as rugged individualism. The public were generally tired of the angry controversies of the 40s and the 50s, of McCarthyism, developing ever larger expectations about their personal futures. They were bent on maximising the substantial economic and educational gains that they were coming to enjoy. Pressure groups too resisted change that threatened their standing. It is simply ahistorical to think that Eisenhower, who was elected as a moderate, could have or should have demanded major reforms. As we'll see as we make our way through the Eisenhower presidency over the next few months, change and reform would be upon Eisenhower through the nascent civil rights struggle, whether he liked it or not, and that would add an entirely different dimension to the Eisenhower presidency. Anyway, until then, thanks so much for listening. Do come and find us at the Explaining History Facebook group. There's always something interesting happening there. Check us out on www.explaininghistory.org. We'll be adding some new content there pretty soon. And all the best. Catch you soon. Bye-bye.